And we're back. Welcome back to Another World Audiobooks. Thank you guys for tuning in today. I really do appreciate everybody who's listening, and especially everybody who is subscribing on YouTube. If you haven't yet, make sure to go over there on YouTube and just search Another World Audiobooks podcast, and that is the best way to bring it up. Or you can go to anotherworldaudiobooks.com and click on the YouTube link there in the top, and that will take you right over there. And just click subscribe. Helps so much to just kind of spread the word and help the channel to continue to grow there. Obviously, doing podcasts is kind of the main focus, but definitely want to grow the YouTube side of things as well if possible. So your help in that would just be super, super appreciated. Thank you guys for listening and sharing the podcast. And we're carrying on with the story of John Carter. If you're enjoying this, I would love to hear from you. Please get in touch with me and make sure to share the podcast with somebody who you know who might enjoy a free audiobook. And then we are getting close to the end of this book, so I want to hear from you. What book would you like to hear next? Get in touch with me, anotherworldaudiobooks@gmail.com, or on the social medias as well. Thanks, guys, and without further ado, let's get into this week's episode. Chapter 13. The Magnet Switch. The guardsmen paid not the slightest attention to their wards, for the red men could not move over 2 feet from the great rings to which they were padlocked, though each had seized a weapon upon which he had been engaged when I entered the room, and stood ready to join me could they have but done so. The yellow men devoted all their attention to me, nor were they long in discovering that the 3 of them were none too many to defend the armory against John Carter. Would that I had had my own good longsword in my hand that day. But as it was, I rendered a satisfactory account of myself with the unfamiliar weapon of the yellow man. At first, I had a time of it dodging their villainous hook swords, but after a minute or two, I had succeeded in wresting a second straight sword from one of the racks along the wall, and thereafter, using it to parry the hooks of my antagonists, I felt more evenly equipped. The 3 of them were on me at once, and but for a lucky circumstance, my end might have come quickly. The foremost guardsman made a vicious lunge for my side with his hook, after the 3 of them had backed me against the wall. But as I sidestepped and raised my arm, his weapon but grazed my side, passing into a rack of javelins where it became entangled. Before he could release it, I had run him through, and then, falling back upon the tactics that have saved me 100 times in tight pinches, I rushed the 2 remaining warriors, forcing them back with a perfect torrent of cuts and thrusts, weaving my sword in and out about their guards until I had the fear of death upon them. Then one of them commenced calling for help, but it was too late to save them. They were as putty in my hands now, and I backed them about the armory as I would until I had them where I wanted them, within reach of the swords of the shackled slaves. In an instant, both lay dead upon the floor. But their cries had not been entirely fruitless, for now I heard answering shouts, and the footfalls of many men running, and the clank of accoutrements and the commands of officers. "The door! Quick, John Carter! Bar the door!" cried Tardos Moores. Already the guard was in sight, charging across the open court that was visible through the doorway. A dozen seconds would bring them into the tower. A single leap carried me to the heavy portal. With a resounding bang, I slammed it shut. "The bar!" shouted Tardos Moores. I tried to slip the huge fastening into place, but it defied my every attempt. "Raise it a little to release the catch!" cried one of the red men. I could hear the yellow warriors leaping along the flagging just beyond the door. I raised the bar and shot it to the right just as the foremost of the guardsmen threw himself against the opposite side of the massive panels. The barrier held. I had been in time, but by the fraction of a second only. Now I turned my attention to the prisoners. To Tardos Moores I went first, asking where the keys might be which would unfasten their fetters. "The officer of the guard has them," replied the Jeddak of Helium, "and he is among those without who seek entrance. You will have to force them." Most of the prisoners were already hacking at their bonds with the swords in their hands. The yellow men were battering at the door with javelins and axes. I turned my attention to the chains that held Tardos Moores. Again and again I cut deep into the metal with my sharp blade, but ever faster and faster fell the torrent of blows upon the portal. At last, a link parted beneath my efforts, and a moment later, Tardos Moores was free, though a few inches of trailing chain still dangled from his ankle. A splinter of wood falling inward from the door announced the headway that our enemies were making toward us. The mighty panels trembled and bent beneath the furious onslaught of the enraged yellow men. What with the battering upon the door and the hacking of the red men at their chains, the din within the armory was appalling. No sooner was Tardos Mors free than he turned his attention to another of the prisoners, while I set to work to liberate Mors Kajak. We must work fast if we would have all those fetters cut before the door gave way. Now, a panel crashed inward upon the floor, and Mors Kajak sprang to the opening to defend the way until we should have time to release the others. With javelins snatched from the wall, he wrought havoc among the foremost of the Okarians, while we battled with the insensate metal that stood between our fellows and freedom. At length, all but one of the prisoners were freed, and then the door fell with a mighty crash before a hastily improvised battering ram, and the yellow horde was upon us. "To the upper chambers!" shouted the red man who was still fettered to the floor. "To the upper chambers! There you may defend the tower against all Cadabra. Do not delay because of me, who could pray for no better death than in the service of Tardos Mors and the Prince of Helium." But I would have sacrificed the life of every man of us rather than desert a single red man, much less the lion-hearted hero who begged us to leave him. "Cut his chains," I cried to two of the red men, "while the balance of us hold off the foe." There were 10 of us now to do battle with the Okarian guard, and I warrant that ancient watchtower never looked down upon a more hotly contested battle than took place that day within its own grim walls. The first inrushing wave of yellow warriors recoiled from the slashing blades of 10 of Helium's veteran fighting men. A dozen Okarian corpses blocked the doorway, but over the gruesome barrier a score more of their fellows dashed, shouting their hoarse and hideous war cry. Upon the bloody mount we met them, hand to hand, stabbing where the quarters were too close to cut, thrusting when we could push a foeman to arm's length, and mingled with the wild cry of Okarian, there rose and fell the glorious words, "For Helium! For Helium!" that for countless ages have spurred on the bravest of the brave to those deeds of valor that have sent the fame of Helium's heroes broadcast throughout the length and breadth of a world. Now were the fetters struck from the last of the red men, and 13 strong we met each new charge of the soldiers of Silensis Ol. Scarce one of us but bled from a score of wounds, yet none had fallen. From without we saw hundreds of guardsmen pouring into the courtyard, and along the lower corridor from which I had found my way to the armory, we could hear the clank of metal and the shouting of men. In a moment we should be attacked from 2 sides, and with all our prowess we could not hope to withstand the unequal odds which would thus divide our attention and our small numbers. "To the upper chambers!" cried Tardos Mors, and a moment later we fell back toward the runway that led to the floors above. Here another bloody battle was waged with the force of yellow men who charged into the armory as we fell back from the doorway. Here we lost our first man, a noble fellow whom we could ill spare, but at length all had backed into the runway except myself, who remained to hold back the Okarians until the others were safe above. In the mouth of the narrow spiral, but a single warrior could attack me at a time, so that I had little difficulty in holding them all back for the brief moment that was necessary. Then, backing slowly before them, I commenced the ascent of the spiral. All the long way to the tower's top, the guardsmen pressed me closely. When one went down before my sword, another scrambled over the dead man to take his place, and thus, taking an awful toll with each few feet gained, I came to the spacious glass-walled watchtower of Cadabra. Here my companions clustered, ready to take my place, and for a moment's respite I stepped to one side while they held the enemy off. From the lofty perch, a view could be had for miles in every direction. Toward the south stretched the rugged ice-clad waste to the edge of the mighty barrier. Toward the east and west, and dimly toward the north, I descried other Okarian cities, while in the immediate foreground, just beyond the walls of Cadabra, the grim guardian shaft reared its somber head. Then I cast my eyes down into the streets of Cadabra, from which a sudden tumult had arisen, and there I saw a battle raging. And beyond the city's walls, I saw armed men marching in great columns toward a nearby gate. Eagerly, I pressed forward against the glass wall of the observatory, scarce daring to credit the testimony of my own eyes. But at last, I could doubt no longer, and with a shout of joy that rose strangely in the midst of the cursing and groaning of the battling men at the entrance to the chamber, I called to Tardos Mors. As he joined me, I pointed down into the streets of Cadabra, and to the advancing columns beyond, above which floated bravely in the Arctic air the flags and banners of Helium. An instant later, Every red man in the lofty chamber had seen the inspiring sight, and such a shout of thanksgiving arose as I warrant never before echoed through that age-old pile of stone. But still, we must fight on, for though our troops had entered Canterbury, the city was yet far from capitulation. Nor had the palace been even assaulted. Turn and turn about we held the top of the runway, while the others feasted their eyes upon the sight of our valiant countrymen battling far beneath us. Now they have rushed the palace gate. Great battering rams are dashed against its formidable surface. Now they are repulsed by a deadly shower of javelins from the wall's top. Once again they charge, but a sortie by a large force of Okarians from an intersecting avenue crumples the head of the column, and the men of Helium go down, fighting beneath an overwhelming force. The palace gate flies open, and a force of the Jedak's own guard, picked men from the flower of the Okarian army, sallies forth to shatter the broken regiments. For a moment, it looks as though nothing could avert defeat, and then I see a noble figure upon a mighty thoat. Not the tiny thoat of the red man, but one of his huge cousins of the dead sea bottoms. The warrior hews his way to the front, and behind him rally the disorganized soldiers of Helium. As he raises his head aloft to fling a challenge at the men upon the palace walls, I see his face, and my heart swells in pride and happiness, as the red warriors leap to the side of their leader and win back the ground they had but just lost. The face of him upon the mighty thoat is the face of my son, Carthoris of Helium. At his side fights a huge Martian warhound, nor did I need a second look to know that it was Woola, my faithful Woola, who had thus well performed his arduous task and brought the succoring legions in the nick of time. In the nick of time? Who yet might say that they were not too late to save, but surely they could avenge, and such retribution as that unconquered army would deal out to the hateful Okarians. I sighed to think that I might not be alive to witness it. Again, I turned to the windows. The red men had not yet forced the outer palace wall, but they were fighting nobly against the best that Okar afforded. Valiant warriors who contested every inch of the way. Now my attention was caught by a new element without the city wall, a great body of mounted warriors looming large above the red men. They were the huge green allies of Helium, the savage hordes from the dead sea bottoms of the far south. In grim and terrible silence they sped on toward the gate, the padded hooves of their frightful mounts giving forth no sound. Into the doomed city they charged, and as they wheeled across the wide plaza before the palace of the Jedak of Jedaks, I saw, riding at their head, the mighty figure of their mighty leader, Tars Tarkus, Jedak of Thark. My wish, then, was to be gratified, for I was to see my old friend battling once again, and though not shoulder to shoulder with him, I, too, would be fighting in the same cause here in the high tower of Okar. Nor did it seem that our foes would ever cease their stubborn attacks, for still they came, though the way to our chamber was often clogged with the bodies of their dead. At times, they would pause long enough to drag back the impeding corpses, and then fresh warriors would forge upward to taste the cup of death. I had been taking my turn with the others in defending the approach to our lofty retreat, when Mors Kajak, who had been watching the battle in the street below, called aloud in sudden excitement. There was a note of apprehension in his voice that brought me to his side the instant that I could turn my place over to another, and as I reached him, he pointed far out across the waste of snow and ice toward the southern horizon. "Alas," he cried, "that I should be forced to witness cruel fate betray them without power to warn or aid, but may be past either now." As I looked in the direction he indicated, I saw the cause of his perturbation. A mighty fleet of flyers was approaching majestically toward Canterbury from the direction of the ice barrier. On and on they came, with ever-increasing velocity. "The grim shaft that they call the Guardian of the North is beckoning to them," said Mors Kajak sadly, "just as it beckoned to Tardos Mors and his great fleet. See where they lie, crumpled and broken, a grim and terrible monument to the mighty force of destruction which naught can resist." I, too, saw, but something else I saw that Mors Kajak did not. In my mind's eye, I saw a buried chamber whose walls were lined with strange instruments and devices. In the center of the chamber was a long table, and before it sat a little pop-eyed old man, counting his money. But plainest of all, I saw upon the wall a great switch, with a small magnet inlaid within the surface of its black handle. Then I glanced out at the fast-approaching fleet. In 5 minutes, that mighty armada of the skies would be bent and worthless scrap, lying at the base of the shaft beyond the city's wall, and yellow hordes would be loosed from another gate to rush out upon the few survivors stumbling blindly down through the mass of wreckage. Then the apse would come. I shuddered at the thought, for I could vividly picture the whole horrible scene. Quick have I always been to decide and act. The impulse that moves me and the doing of the thing seems simultaneous. For if my mind goes through the tedious formality of reasoning, it must be a subconscious act of which I am not objectively aware. Psychologists tell me that, as the subconscious does not reason, too close a scrutiny of my mental activities might prove anything but flattering. But be that as it may, I have often won success, while the thinker would have been still at the endless task of comparing various judgments. And now, celerity of action was the prime essential to the success of the thing that I had decided upon. Grasping my sword more firmly in my hand, I called to the red men at the opening of the runway to stand aside. "Way for the Prince of Helium!" I shouted. And before the astonished yellow man, whose misfortune it was to be at the fighting end of the line at that particular moment, could gather his wits together, my sword had decapitated him, and I was rushing like a mad bull down upon those behind him. "Way for the Prince of Helium!" I shouted as I cut a path through the astonished guardsmen of Silence's Hole. Hewing to right and left, I beat my way down that warrior-choked spiral until, near the bottom, those below, thinking that an army was descending upon them, turned and fled. The armory at the first floor was vacant when I entered it, the last of the Okarians having fled into the courtyard, so none saw me continue down the spiral toward the corridor beneath. Here I ran as rapidly as my legs would carry me toward the 5 corners, and there plunged into the passageway that led to the station of the old miser. Without the formality of a knock, I burst into the room. There sat the old man at his table, but as he saw me, he sprang to his feet, drawing his sword. With scarce more than a glance toward him, I leaped for the great switch, but quick as I was, that wiry old fellow was there before me. How he did it I shall never know, nor does it seem credible that any Martian-born creature could approximate the marvelous speed of my earthly muscles. Like a tiger he turned upon me, and I was quick to see why Solon had been chosen for this important duty. Never in all my life have I seen such wondrous swordsmanship and such uncanny agility as that ancient bag of bones displayed. He was in 40 places at the same time, and before I had half a chance to awaken to my danger, he was like to have made a monkey of me, and a dead monkey at that. It is strange how new and unexpected conditions bring out unguessed ability to meet them. That day, in the buried chamber beneath the palace of Silence's Hole, I learned what swordsmanship meant, and to what heights of sword mastery I could achieve when pitted against such a wizard of the blade as Solon. For a time, he liked to have bested me, but presently the latent possibilities that must have been lying dormant within me for a lifetime came to the fore, and I fought as I had never dreamed a human being could fight. That duel royal should have taken place in the dark recesses of a cellar, without a single appreciative eye to witness it, has always seemed to me almost a world calamity, at least from the viewpoint Barsoomian, where bloody strife is the first and greatest consideration of individuals, nations, and races. I was fighting to reach the switch, Solon to prevent me, and though we stood not 3 feet from it, I could not win an inch toward it, for he forced me back an inch for the first 5 minutes of our battle. I knew that if I were to throw it in time to save the oncoming fleet, it must be done in the next few seconds, and so I tried my old rushing tactics, but I might as well have rushed a brick wall for all that Solon gave way. In fact, I came near to impaling myself upon his point for my pains, but right was on my side, and I think that must give a man greater confidence than though he knew himself to be battling in a wicked cause. At least, I did not want in confidence, and when next I rushed Solon, it was to one side with implicit confidence that he must turn to meet my new line of attack, and turn he did, so that now we fought with our sides toward the coveted goal. The great switch stood within my reach upon my right hand. To uncover my breast for an instant would have been to court sudden death, but I saw no other way to chance it, if by so doing I might rescue that oncoming succoring fleet. And so, in the face of a wicked sword thrust, I reached out my point and caught the great switch a sudden blow that released it from its seating. So surprised and horrified was Solon that he forgot to finish his thrust. Instead, he wheeled toward the switch with a loud shriek. A shriek which was his last. For before his hand could touch the lever it sought, my sword's point had passed through his heart. Cutting it close there, John. Alright guys, like I said, I want to hear from you. What book would you like to hear next on the podcast? Get in touch with me. Just go to the website, anotherworldaudiobooks.com. That is a great place to go, regardless of whether you want to talk to me or not. You can request a free audiobook, and that is, just for listeners of the show. Just go to anotherworldaudiobooks.com. There's a big button that says request your free audiobook, so click on that. I would love to send you any of the books that are in the Another World Audiobooks library as a thank you for being an awesome listener and for helping the show grow. So thanks guys so much, and we'll catch you next week. Thanks.
The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is,
"Thank you for calling. Please listen to your list of 46 possible service options."
which is why when you choose USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable. 24/7 online service for claims, access to roadside assistance, and more. All at the touch of a button. Start getting the service you deserve. Get a quote today. Ability to receive a quote depends on membership eligibility. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
This episode is brought to you by Bai. It's Wonder Water. What makes Bai so great? It's simple. From Raspberry Lemon Lime by Sydney Sweeney to Zambia Bing Cherry and Palavo Pineapple Mango, Bai has antioxidants, electrolytes, and no artificial sweeteners. So for flavorful hydration, choose Bai. It's Wonder Water. Learn more about Bai and discover all of the exotic, bold flavors at drinkbai.com.